Hello everyone. So, don't worry, I'm not going to stop here for too long. Because we are kind of coming near the end of the story. And of course, well, might as well repair that while I'm here. Anyway, and meine assault carbines as well. Well, it saves on my calorie weight. But anyway, what I'm here to do is just a little bit more chat for the politics of writing. So, as before, this isn't going to necessarily be the most child-friendly. So, anyone under 18, please show this to your parents, guardians, or any other suitable adult for their approval first, and teachers, parents, and what have you. Please check this video before showing it to your children. You know. But here's the important point. Because, as I say, we're not going to go on much more with the Divide. I'm getting near the end now, and, well, there's spoilers here. This'll be rather spoiler-heavy, and, you know, just because I'm not getting that emotionally invested into the story doesn't mean the rest of you shouldn't either. Shouldn't have my spoiling it for you. Plus, of course, it might be enjoyable and entertaining as a game, but now, as I say, the reason why I'm not so emotionally invested is partly because there's a little bit of jank, I believe the chaps call it these days. And that jank comes in with the nature of Courier 6. Because, well, you are in a very personal conflict, as it were. Everything's entirely you. But at the same time, because this is based on the regular Fallout New Vegas, and you're a customizable character, pretty much as close to tabula rasa as you can get when you're on Doc Mitchell's bed, you are everyone. You could be anyone. You could be anyone. You could be everyone. You're not even referred to by your character's by the in-game name you have assigned yourself when you woke up in Doc Mitchell's medical bay. You're here just referred to as Courier 6. As you wander the Mojave. I apologise if I'm mispronouncing any of the words. Anyway, more to the point. Here we are, just in this video. We're going to chat, as we go forward, more about conflict. Because in the last 2 episodes of the politics of writing, we discussed the pieces, as it were, both on the macro level, and towards the more micro level. But of course, their interaction is where the story is going to be based, in a lot of ways. Now, conflict is perhaps a relatively strong word, but, well, perhaps it is necessary, at least in this context. So, I will now move on. Leave behind this save. You might see it again in a future video when I have completed the Lonesome Road and have crossed the Divide. But for now, we're going to go to a different kind of conflict. One that happens more frequently, and also is perhaps the polar opposite. See you on the beaches. Okay, so we're not quite on the beaches yet, but yeah, it's on the way. You know, might take me a bit of a while, but you know, let's talk a little bit about my character. Who is my character in this game? What's their name? Dunno. Probably never will. Well, they're listed as player. And I'm just gonna take myself a little landing craft and go on to Omaha Beach. Because in some ways, this is probably more accurate in a lot of ways, because, you know, for a lot of ordinary soldiers, well, we were just ordinary people. They were just ordinary people, not like supermen or... And hey, you know, we're just out here because this is the war we've got caught up in. You know, all the different personal stuff doesn't really matter so much. Even if, you know, even my character in Battlefield 1942 here isn't a sniper per se, but we're probably more the role of a designated marksman. But, yeah, as I say, it just feels like, to my mind, a power fantasy in a war, it doesn't really feel right to me, you know, especially for a real world war, because these were like real people, and I know because of that sort of ordinary nature of the war, of ordinary people thrown into an extraordinary situation, I just feel like that's more my thing and just doesn't. It feels a bit less icky, you know. Now I know that might sound controversial, especially given the fact that this year is the 80th anniversary of D-Day, but the idea of ordinary people thrown into extraordinary circumstances, that's mainly the idea of a lot of political conflicts. Most of them aren't the thing where you necessarily choose a side. Some kind of, like, circumstance birth, nation, or some other grouping tends to put you in a particular side. Well, let's see if we can make it a little bit less grim in the next segment. Hello. So, I think now we've got to the point in the video where I just answer a question that some people might have. Like, Ed, you know, you've done a lot of politics videos. This is part 3 of the politics of writing. Why do you like politics so much? There's a very simple answer to that question. I don't. It's quite tiring, quite depressing, and well, after so many years, and I feel quite dispiriting a lot of times. But I got into it to try and make friends. Most of the people I knew were political, and I just wanted to try and help out. It's the best I can do. Of course, what a lot of people don't understand about building a democracy is that it takes, well, let's just see this sort of standard method. I'll just go into the world builder so I can demonstrate it more quickly. What was ecology that created that thing? Turns out no. Sort of like, now where's medicine? There it is. Okay. Think that basically it's just a matter of discovering the right things, which in Civ's case is by technology, because it's developed by technology. Then a few turns for a revolution, and then once you've sort of sorted out, you know, the sort of period of chaos, as you decide as you try and work out the correct balance of everything, you then have your complete democracy. Probably some of the issues Civ has is that it's progressive. I mean that in the historical sense, i.e. that it believes that humans and, well, history in general is progressing towards certain things, be it, well, in this case, liberal democracy, the nation state, the single unified thought, the liberation of the working class, what have you. So you've got but the point is, a lot of people think that a democracy is just like part 1, set up a few constitutional and liberal freedoms, and then
air cover's on the way. Visibility clear.
And then just rocking up.
Always prepared.
Yeah, and then part clinical step 2 being rocking up with a whole load of freedom and a whole load of
He's on the target list.
A whole load of freedom ready to send them
Rally
down.
point confirmed.
Yeah, that being part 1.
On the go. Take a new position. Rally point confirmed. Tomahawk Watcher armed and ready.
Just
Preparing cycle.
to say, rocking on up. Yeah.
Missile guidance.
So with part 1 being develop the liberal reforms,
Arming cruise missile.
then part 2 being sort of like write off everyone who doesn't like this sort of personal freedom, neoliberal lack of, you know,
Cruise missiles ready.
that kind of thing, labeling, rewriting the narrative to make them into the
Standing by.
terrorists.
Flight systems activated.
into terrorists, and then rocking up.
Enemy vehicle. Assuming control.
Rocking up, destroying
Missile guide was set. Instructions confirmed. Cruise missiles ready.
destroying the terrorist base,
Taking charge.
and then just raising the flag of democracy over the democracy over the base to basically just liberate everyone there, and well,
The building is captured.
then a sort of bit of shock and awe later, mission, and just time that right, and a bit of shock and awe later, and
On your command.
as bit of shock and awe later,
Reset.
and mission accomplished, and wham bam balam,
You are victorious.
you have a democracy, or at least so people often thought. As, yes. Hence why people often asked me when I was, back in 21, what happened, when Kabul fell, as it were, fell to the Taliban. People asked me, what happened? So, let's talk a little bit about the actual way. Now, I say this is being a popular misconception. I'm not going to get at you too much if you thought this was the way democracies were built, but I'm going to talk a bit more in the following footage about how you actually build a democracy. So, you might be wondering, what even is a democracy? Well, you may have been told it means rule by the people. This, however, is wrong. It actually means rule by the daimoi. And daimoi, in ancient Athens, was the subdivision of the Athenian polis based on specific areas of land. Now, this is actually very different to a lot of ruling systems, because unlike those ruling systems, power doesn't come from being a member of the particular class, be it the king, be it the nobility, be it the merchants, the church, und so weiter, but from living on the land. And this recognition that you have an ought. You are a being that can reason right from wrong, or how things ought to be, beyond your mere instincts. I know this is pretty basic Hegelian philosophy, but it's worth making sure we're all on the same page. Which is also how you can tell an identitarian movement. A lot of people get confused about this idea, because you see a lot of movements that are about people, there's an idea of inclusion, really. It's saying, this is our society as well, but we are either legally or de facto not being fully included, and having our ought is being disregarded or not recognised. Now, of course, the fundamental premise of a democracy is that everyone in the daimoi, or the land, however you subdivide it, is a part of the body politic. So this ought, which animals don't have, children don't have yet, but as Hegel will recognise they can learn, they will, over the course of their growing up, learn an ought. And, well, the point of a democracy is to have that fully recognised, regardless of any other connection. And from there you might be thinking, oh yeah, that's where that left-right spectrum comes in. And yes, as promised, the samurai sword is here. We will be discussing the left-right spectrum in this video. And you might be thinking, oh yeah, Ed, I know that story. You know, politics has been rumbling along in a sort of divine right of kings, though sometimes not. But sometimes not always accepting that, like in the 1600s in England. You know, 1688, but all that. You know, 1688 and all that. And then, they have a little revolution in France. Mein hat change over. So they're like, vive la liberté, vive égalité, vive equalité, liberté, égalité, fraternité. I apologize for my French pronunciation is very poor, but I'll try and dramatically recreate. And so we got this now, we have reassembled the General Assembly. And so it'd be like, okay, anyone, okay, alright, who wants the king to have a partial veto? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, was that okay, who wants the king to have an absolute veto? 1, 2, 3, 4, you know, I cannot count all 1,500 of you like this. Okay, I have an idea. Everyone who wants the king to have a partial veto in the new constitution, sit on the left wing of the chambre. Everyone who thinks everyone who wants the king to have an absolute veto, sit on the right side of the chambre. Everyone who wants the king to have a partial veto, sit on the left side of the chambre. Okay. The architectural ring of left and right, and basically let us organize it on that way. The more you want the king to retain, or perhaps local authorities to retain power, you sit on the right side, on the right wing. You sit closer to the right wing of the building. And if you think that the king should have a partial veto and more power to go to the General Assembly, you should sit on the left, closer to the left wing of the building. That is good. And then, good. Good. Then, of course, and France carried on like that, while the Anglophone thing was all like, oh no, have their own sort of way of organising things, you know. So you'll see, there are, well, radicals. Those who wish to destroy absolutely everything of the old order. Radical socialists, radical liberals, radical nationalists, all of those are on one side. Right. They see nothing good in the way things are, and so they wish to smash it down completely. And then, on the other side, there are reactionaries. They see no good in change at all. They want to roll everything back. But this is, of course, that's something we ought to know. Yes, and they ought to stand as an iron guard against all change, ready to fend it off. Of course, there is also us conservatives, as we are known in this time period. Peelites, also known as, following Robert Peel, especially in Britain, who believe that we must stay the course. For there is change that is inevitable in our ever-changing world, and change that is good, and change that is bad, for there is good in the old order,
And so, like a jam, we must conserve the old order. And what was good about it, while allowing its fetters to fall away as progress marches on. On, but never to fall to the radical or reactionary rhetoric. No, 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 no.
And this all bumbled along for the rest of the 19th century and started into the 20th. Then, of course, World War I happens. We just fight. Yes. Right. Then World War I happens, and the world of the Roaring Twenties is kind of like, okay, we got a new political order, everybody. We got ourselves a whole heap of trouble. Revolution in Russia, reactionaries in Italy. 1922, Mussolini comes head of Italy, and his new fascist movement takes over the country. Well, what are we going to do out here? Well, I don't know, folks. Let's organize it better. How about so? We say that everyone who's kind of like the Soviets and communists, all that stuff, they're on the left. We'll call them the left. Put them on the left side of the spectrum and say, yep, they are left-wing. Wing, if you want to get more like Lenin or Stalin or however, or if you're more like Mussolini's mob the fascists and all that, you're on the right. And if you're a straight-shooting liberal, believes in liberal democracy, the virtues of voting and public responsibility, accountable government, and maybe some welfare to keep everybody from going nuts and killing one another, you're a liberal centrist, and that is the good old American way. Or British, or Canadian, or wherever we are. Basically, we have communism on the left, fascism on the right, and down the center is good old democracy. Oh, say, can't you see by the dawn's early light? And yeah, and there, so and so and so. So anyway, that's the story. That this kind of situation has emerged. But, well, now it's time to give my thoughts. Cue the montage! Well, that's certainly one way to welcome fantasy and world music by the Feisters back to the channel. With a montage that I don't know whether the Japanese cultural imagery or my sword technique was worse. Was a worse choice on my part. But the Japanese cultural imagery is at least making of sense, perhaps. Because we're discussing Japanese history. Specifically, the Boshin Jidai. A time when Japan underwent great changes. When the long-standing Tokugawa shogunate ended and was replaced by the emperor. And westernization of the country emerged. But here's another question for you. What should we make of this in terms of the left-right spectrum? Would it be that and apologies to Sabaton for my incredibly bad cover. Encircled by a vulture, the end of left-wing culture, the dawn of destiny draws near. Or would it be more accurate to say, the left-wing falsified, facing 500 samurai, surrounded and outnumbered 60 to 1, the right faced the gun. Well, you might be wondering, okay Ed, why do you have to butcher Sabaton like that? Well, it was from a conversation I had many years ago. Two chaps set up a politics society. They wanted me to be a part of it, offering team left and team right, with the thesis being that the left-right spectrum was the basis of all human disagreement, and it could be found running through everything. And they said, give us a challenge. You know, we'll prove it to you. Name a conflict in human history and we'll tell you whether it was left-wing, how the left-right spectrum fitted it. So I said to them, what about the Boshin Jidai? They thought, bit of pause, and I said, oh, I can explain. They said, oh, no. We know about that one. That's a good pick. Well, you see, one of them then began, you see, the emperor was left-wing because he was trying to create a rational government based on principles of the rule of law rather than family lineage that the shogunate was based on. And the other jumped in, no, mate. The emperor was right-wing because he was trying to westernize and modernize Japan, while the shogunate was fighting for a tradition that was standing against Western normative values that were basically being forced upon the country through colonization. The other was like, what, so you're saying a feudal hierarchy is left-wing? And they were discussing these points, you know, having a gentlemanly, quite pleasant discussion. But, you know, I left those two chaps be. But let us say, it's a lot more complicated than that. Well, let's talk about tradition and modernity. For you see, it's not as cut and dry. I mean, for one thing, it was the emperor who originally tried to kick out the foreigners, as it were, who wanted to get rid of the foreign merchants and stuff from Japan. And the shogun had no real intention of following those orders. Which brings us to a kicker. The diarchy of the shogun and the emperor. Which one held political authority in Japan going forward? And what would happen when the two collided? after all. But let's talk a bit about modernity, about the idea, because thanks to novels such as The Last Samurai, a lot of people have the idea that this conflict was about tradition and modernisation. However, there's a context to why tradition was so valued. But you see, modernity did not come in friendship. Modernity came off the Western gunboat, telling Japan to open up or they'd be opened up. The trading treaties were unequal and highly unpopular in many parts of Japan, because it seemed like, you know, all that wealth, all of Japan's wealth was going to get looted by the foreigners. And so maintaining the traditional ways was in some ways a matter of protection. And of course there's another side to it as well. Loyalty, clan interest. Now, in the south, which was the area that modernised and industrialised the quickest, and was the first to embrace it, there'd been a long history of trade. Some of the exemptions to Japanese isolation had existed in the south. The Dutch had maintained a trading port island. Via the Ryukyu, contact with China had been maintained, and so on and so on. But of course, there was also land that had been heavily settled for centuries, if not millennia, of Japanese history. So there were relatively few advances, or social mobility rather, in land that there was in trade. And which is why, even before the end of isolation, we've often seen the merchant classes be more predominant, grow fastest in southern Japan, and the north was a bit different, because not because there was more backward or anything, more just because you could rise through land. Land was being settled, pushing out, sometimes, you know, pushing out indigenous Ainu was another factor that comes into this sort of history from what I've read of it. You know, in the more northern reaches of Honshu, you had easier access to becoming minor gentry. Minor gentry were able to grow from their land and have some semblance of stability from it. But if their tenant farmers left, they'd have a much harder time than the landowners in the south, who often had much larger estates, held more of the land, and of course had the capital to invest, and had the capital from years of, well, centuries even, of feudal rents and other things, to invest in trade, invest in industry. And so we get southern and of course further and further away from Edo, or Tokyo as it's now called. Again, my Japanese is not the best. There was perhaps a greater resentment towards the power of the shogun, and further from his reach, opposition forces could grow more easily, especially if they had a bit more capital independence from independence. And so we can often see the left-right spectrum feels a bit strange, meaningless perhaps. And culture, as well as cultural diversity and manoeuvring, you know, some culture, you know, at that time when communications were slower, it was perhaps easier for southern Japan to be more exposed to different cultures and identities than it was further north. So, where do we stand? So what exactly would a left-right spectrum be on here? Well, thing is, there is practical incentives. A lot of what went on in Japan in this time period was based on a lot more considerations than just what an individual believed about the left and the right. Or, you know, whether that idea even made sense in Japan at this time. I couldn't find much source on that. Similar to the Wars of the Roses, really, or the English Civil War, it's a bit hard to retroactively fit the political spectrum onto this context. But indeed, that's kind of the point of this video. In that context of European colonialism, industrialization, you know, what, yeah, that's, you know, one of the bits of the stories that's often forgotten is what modernization meant for a lot of people. It could mean being, you know, if modernization meant losing your family's wealth, you might want to say, let's respect the emperor and repel the barbarians, because they're taking your livelihood away. That can sound pretty reasonable, and, you know, to some of the Ainu people, they might have felt the same way. But I digress. And you know what? I'm white as hell and thick as grass, so it's not like I'm going to be a good historian on this matter. Perhaps I can just say what I read about over the years. But but that's the point. And I could use any period of history I liked. In some ways, this one has a lot of nice juicy factors we can talk about, a lot of topics and a lot of intersectionality we can talk about. You know, capital, colonialism, culture, colliding on the fields of Japan. And in the castle. And so, you know, and it's a well talked about topic. The way it's perhaps romanticised as a struggle of tradition and modernity, perhaps because maybe some Western audiences aren't so comfortable with what modernity meant in 19th century Japan. But still, in a way, any kind of person, the idea, what I'm basically saying is, a person's beliefs will often exist, but they will exist in a practical circumstance. Well, so how about we go settle those things a bit more generally? We've got a few present. So, with all that in mind, you might be wondering, so what is the purpose of government? Oh, and I also happened to use an article while looking at this, specifically this article of Did Hegel Have a Philosophy of Public Policy by Daniel Little, published on January 10th, 2020 on philpublicpolicy.org. And I'll link this in the description. But, you know, to help me collect my thoughts and make sure I'd got all the Hegel right. Because some people might think, so we start at the first constituency. You know, what is the most basic political unit? Is it the built environment? Is it the family? Or is it the individual themselves. Well, at the most basic level, when you're all in the Kemet, or I think that's pronounced Hemet in English, as in Volkhemet. Or is that Swedish? Either way. When you're in this sort of thing, everyone kind of knows each other already. So it's probably not that relevant in that sense because, well, at the point where the most basic political unit is the primary focus of a society, you don't have a particularly complex one. And hence why what the purpose of government was in the ancient and medieval world was relatively straightforward. You'd have the king or queen sometimes, the crown, let's say, and their job was to sort of keep order, you know, make sure that the noble families, the religious order, any kind of armed forces and the local peasantry and all that, made sure that nobody really pushed anyone else too much. And for that, they had a special kind of administrator, you know, for when you get beyond the sort of Kemet level of polity. And what is this kind of person? Well, we'll get into them in a minute. Hegel uses the term the knight errant. Now, for this kind of administrator. Now, I'm not as fond of this way of talking about them. I think it skews a little bit too much towards, you know, thinking. It has a sort of inherent bias, I feel, towards a centralized government. So I'll use a slightly more neutral version. I don't know a good English term, but how about we'll use the term boyar. So the local boyar would be the one selected by the monarch to go and keep order. And, you know, that's pretty much what they do. Now, we start seeing a few changes especially by the 18th century. The roots of them seem to start in the 15th century in our timeline, but in the 18th in Europe, and then the 19th century as, well, European gunboats start spreading it around the world, we get these kind of structures called the nation state. And so things get a little bit more complicated, because no longer is everyone a kind of self-governing unit in negotiation with the realm. They are all subject of the realm. And so we start getting that question, and, you know, whether this situation came about through state or capital, people will argue about for, well, probably till the kingdom comes, if you want to believe how I feel. But either way, doesn't matter here. Point is we ended up in a situation whereby governance started to become more complicated. So what does this knight errant or boyar do? Well, Hegel argues that they are an inherently subjective being. Now, yeah, that's partly right. Humans are inherently do have an inherently subjective, and even if they do aspire to be more objective. But what is this subjectivity to? Well, the dynamic of family life, of the local families that the boyar comes from. This is how I'd put it. The needs of their local community, or their own sense of right and wrong, their own ethics, or, dare I say it, morals of the boyar will affect how they make their decisions in administering the will of the nation state. Same way that it did with the king. But when it's more diplomatic, perhaps that was seen as more forgivable. But so Who comes in their place? Well, yes, it's said possibly because capital requires predictability, formula, safety. Possibly because the state needs regularity, you know, or the needs of the military-industrial complex, you know, as nations compete against one another. But as a writer, you probably don't need to worry about the historical theory as to where the modern state emerged from. But these sort of three broad strokes are at least somewhat useful to have in the back of your mind, depending on how you want to think about it. So, but is the state perhaps less about keeping order? Is it perhaps about pushing an idea, an ideology, bringing people in line with the general will? Is it more about trade-offs? You know, some things, you know, which do we value more as a society? Or what is the objectively better result, the min-maxing version of it? Is it perhaps to fulfill the popular mandate, as opposed to not so much guiding the people, but letting the people take the wheel? Although, who are the people? The people are many. Is the state perhaps here to adjudicate on the conflicts that exist? You know, as a sort of rule maker. So like the referee who say, right, you're out of line, or you're in line, carry on, keep going, guys. Or, you know, trying to balance out societal conflicts or stuff. And, or is it perhaps to protect the profit of capital? Well, who will do that? Maybe the bureaucrat, as Hegel calls them. And, you know, in this sense, fair enough. I might use the term oprischnik, but doesn't really matter in this sense. That's just, as I say, my English being a sort of second language. But point is, Hegel's big emphasis on the bureaucrat, it's part of the reason for the common stereotype that Hegel was a socialist or a communist. Although this comes into a slight misconception about the nature of bureaucracy, which I'll probably get onto on the next slide, Hegel feels that the bureaucrat is objective, or at least, and the knight-errant is subjective. However, that's a little bit of a simplification, because while Hegel does seem to argue that the bureaucrat is at least designed to be objective, Hegel also acknowledges that the bureaucrat's objectivity has to be maintained. He recommends by giving them good compensation or pay, pay them well, to make sure that they are not easily swayed by their own financial difficulties, I believe you might argue. I'm trying to think of a good way. Sorry, these aren't exact quotes. I'm trying to think of good ways of phrasing these issues. But you can administer a state through a bureaucrat or oprischnik, a knight-errant or boyar, and say the boyar being perhaps arguably more tied to the local area, while the oprischnik is sort of much more linked to the state. And there is also the other option, military governance, or the strelet. Now, we'll get back to the streltsy later, but let's talk a little bit about the bureaucrat. Now, you might think of the bureaucrat as a sort of left-wing body. Sometimes it's why I use the term oprischnik, because then people don't have that sort of mental image. But thing is, there are different ways of being a bureaucrat or being oprishnik. There might be the social engineer, someone who's taking a proactive role in reorganizing society, which some might call pretty left-wing, although we'll go into some more nuance later. And to be quite frank, well, this video at some point will discuss my views on the left-right spectrum, so, you know, I don't need to go into detail at this point, right? Because by the time you're watching this, I'll have already discussed that idea. So we have the social engineer, but you can also be an administrator through a more legalist lens, like Kungzi, or Confucius if you prefer. And I apologize to all the Chinese people listening for my butchering of the pronunciation, because I am not very good. But anyway, more to the point, I mean, and hey, even that interpretation of Kungzi's arguments is still subjective. But anyway, the idea of a lawyer, that you're the rule of law administrator, a bit less proactive, more about, okay, Parliament, the Senate, what have you, has laid down the law. So how are we to enforce it? But we're not really meant to stray from the path. Or are we? We can throw in some more nuance later. And then, of course, there is that other function of the oprishnik, the officer, the, how you call them, Kommissar, Polizei, Gauleiter. I'm trying to think of a good way of explaining words. As I say, English, not my strong point. But their job, but that interpretation of bureaucracy, it's more about not just enforcing law, but enforcing rights, as it were. Individual, private property rights. And yes, that might seem to be fundamentally upholding a status quo, how you say it. But that will depend on your society, exactly. But as I say, this is about the context. So let's dig in and get to know these forms of oprishnik a bit better. First, the function of the social engineer. Maybe they are socially engineering society towards consensus. You know, listening to each different community's voice. If you've ever heard the phrase equality of outcome, you know, this one is theirs, the equality of outcome, and the bureaucrat or oprishnik is trying to arrange society in this sense. Or maybe this is more about keeping the economy flowing. The technocratic, if you like. You know, making sure that business has what it needs to run efficiently. And that this will benefit society as a whole with more jobs, more product, and generally a greater financial stability, although, and in case you're wondering, the means of production will be discussed later. And of course, the idea of round table discussion. Individual people, each with their voice, you know, equality of opportunity, one might say. Everyone has the same foot in the door. The seat at the table. We're not trying to engineer a society where our differences are either bulldozed or put on pedestals in this version. What some call meritocracy. But let's talk further. For we have the legalist. And what do they do? Well, they could perhaps rule law in a more strictly egalitarian, in the sense of everyone is equal before the law. This would be very much a judicial bureaucracy. You know, we apply every detail equally, we don't make exceptions, we have the standard form, and it will be applied directly, no favours, no special treatments, no one raised above another, even if they happen to be lower down by market mechanism. That doesn't matter. The law must treat everyone equally. Or perhaps, this is they're reading it based on precedent. What rulings have gone before? What rulings have gone before? The common law system, one might say. Hey, society moving forward, and the judges, so, this bureaucracy might well take the judge's lead. Say, well, we've got case law, we've got precedent, we follow on these. And of course, equity. Each experience in society, we want to treat everyone equally. That kind of equality before the law is not quite enough, but everyone should have the same opportunities. Again, crossing over with the previous category, but this sort of idea of equity. What is fair in each circumstance? But unlike the previous type of bureaucracy, we're not searching out situations, but we are finding them in society and acting with a principle of fairness towards all people, regardless of their background and or social circumstance, based on this principle. And then this third category of oprishnik I've come up with, the enforcer. Is this a protective kind of officer? Are they there to keep the public safe from harm, no matter how many air quotes you want to put around that? Is it perhaps more antagonistic? Is the assumption that the population is not perhaps needing to be saved from itself, but needing to be saved from social disruption? Or is it going to be openly enforcing hierarchy? There is, but, there are no human rights, just property rights, or something like that. Some people have argued for over the years. It's more a bureaucracy about defending those individuals from the rest of society. But, as I say, with all these classes, all these types of bureaucracy, of oprishnik, don't think of them as strict labels, strict categories. Mix them up, blend them, and to be quite frank, you'll have different personality in your bureaucracy. Whatever model you go with, the state might have a particular emphasis they lean on, but not everyone takes up a position based on their beliefs. Some people, it's just the qualifications they have, but either way. Let's continue. Because we have that other category, the streltsy, or as an individual, strelet, a military admin of your body politic. In fact, what is the military's relationship to the body politic in your world? Are they sort of politically neutral? They stay out of things. They let other factions get involved. Or do their own thing. Are they very much in control? You know, the guardians, protectors of the society, rooting out all enemies without and within. The only one to keep the blanket to keep you safe from the scary monsters. Or are they the last line of the Constitution's defense? You know, the reason why some autocratic group doesn't take power or what have you is because they can't get the military to support them. You know, that they're loyal to the Constitution, but no politician. That is politician. That is also why the Streltsy is a slightly interesting version of class. Because military life tends to draw people from all kinds of backgrounds. And a very large number of viewpoints, partly because the requirements of warfare tend to be very adaptive, very cohesive focused. Essentially, diverse perspective is necessary because you need to think adaptably on a battlefield because, of course, war is very unpredictable. And the situations can change at any moment. So being able to think in a dynamic way is highly beneficial on a battlefield because you can adapt. Like, sorry, I can't snap my fingers very well. You can just adapt on the fly, turn on a Kopek and make moves. And so that's a sort of basic relationship of power. As I say, none of these categories should really be treated as their own independent thing or fixed or entirely affixed. I've separated them out and put up pictures to help educate people. So, you know, because it's easier with education if you've got something to visualize. I know I'm a very visual thinker. Perhaps this helps. So, either way, let's go further. And so, let's have a quick look. We're at the means of production. Some fairly basic stuff because let's start out with the factors of production. So we have our natural resources, but they've got to be turned into a product, in theory. Well, if we want a product to exist, then the natural resources have to be turned out. So how do we do that? Well, we need some land. You know, a sort of place to turn the natural resource into a product. Then we also need capital. A lot of people think of capitals like stocks and shares, money, but there's more to capital than that. In fact, capital really includes all the tools, equipment, and the like needed to make a product. And of course, we need labor. And labor is a bit more complicated. So let's talk about that a bit further. So, laborers back in the day, like really ancient times, would do pretty much all of it themselves. And production was a bit, well, there weren't very many products. Most stuff was subsistence, and, you know, a lot of the fancy, ornate, or higher value products were very laborious to make, very time consuming, very slow, and very few of them could be made. And, you know, at certain points, some of these labourers weren't even independent anymore. Somebody else took over, a landowner, what we call feudalism, where the aristocracy owned the land and the labourers worked their tools. Pretty straightforward. Obviously, I've grossly oversimplified feudalism there, but you get this idea. Somebody owns the tool, and somebody else works their tool. Now, things got more complicated, and whether it was for state or capital-based reasons, by about the 18th and then it really kicked off in the 19th century, although with some of the roots going back to the 15th century, things get even more complex because labour has to specialise. So, you know, not just someone who'll work your tool, but someone who's got to work out what to do with it. The entrepreneur. The manager, who organises labour, who organises all the workers. And another category of some would include this within entrepreneur, the sort of designer of the product. Essentially, one does the supply. You know, somebody's got to market, you know, find the market. Someone's got to make the product, design the product. And thus you get all these specializations. But ultimately, they're all labour. They're all labourers. And the point is, somebody called a capitalist owns the tools, and the labourer works their tool. As in, the tool is owned by the capitalist. The labourer's not working their own tool. That can come later. And, well, so as I say, got a capitalist and a labourer. And then we got other parts of the economy because, well, say we've got the consumer base after all. Products need somebody to buy them to be seen as needing to be produced in a market economy. Hey, somebody's got to educate the labourers so they can operate the tools, more complex tools, do various jobs and basically develop the economy even further. We've got to have a sense of place, a sort of social space where products can be exchanged, ideas can be floated, and the social life needed for the product to enter the market and then exit the market when somebody's bought it can happen. The place of exchange between capital and commodity. And of course, a government of some description there to oversee, or perhaps do a bit more, but that will vary based on your capitalist system, and oversee all these different things. And apart from labour and capital, so what I've broken down as the sort of consumer base, education system, social space, and government are what's called the superstructure. So capital and labour form your base, your consumer base, your education system, your social space, and your government form the superstructure. Very simplified, but hey, we're writers, not advanced economists, and even I'm not that advanced. So, anyway, let's continue. Because what is the capitalist's incentive? Now, as nice as they can be, they still have incentives. And theirs is to make a profit. Now, what's your labourer's incentive? It's to meet their life needs. Some of these are purely physical, some of these are purely social, some of these are purely emotional, some of these are spiritual, und so weiter, und so weiter. Point is, they will need some kind of recompense or resource to sustain themselves in this world. World of capitalism. Which, and then we have the superstructures incentives. Let's see them all again, shall we? So, our government, consumer, education and social space, they have other incentives as well. You know, they'll need to meet their needs because, you know, they're still humans and populated by and their social structures populated by humans. But they may also want the market to function because, in a way, their existence kind of also depends on a functional economy. Because, I mean, for example, if you're a consumer and there's no products available, things are going to be quite problematic. You know, teachers rely on salaries, which are, and government revenue relies on taxes, mostly. I mean, sometimes government's own industry, but inside, and of course, social spaces. People need their finance and get a bit more antsy when their financial situation's there. But there's also the popular will to meet. And public order to maintain. Now, are these all mutually exclusive? Well, we'll talk about that in a bit, but point is, so a lot of the superstructure often finds itself a bit pulled towards different things because they've got different they've got a complex structure of incentives. So what about this public good? Because, I mean, a lot of people seem to portray politics as about extracting the profit of capital, of the capitalist, to pay for public good, as though there's only a finite amount of labour or work and there's only a finite amount of money. But it doesn't necessarily have to be this way. I mean, we can also structure things a little bit differently, such as a more consultative work, or a sort of, you know, getting the whole community involved in the making of profit and supporting those in need, and using profit to support the entire community in need. Because let's face it, a capitalist still lives in a community. They still have people. And hey, if they design a product, they're also functioning, and you know, if they work into creating the product, a lot of small business owners are actually part of the labor force as well, by the fact that they have to design the product, find the market. So they're not necessary. So all I'm trying to say here is that profit and public good are not necessarily mutually exclusive, even if they're often presented as such. Now, what is that public good? I mean, for example, is there some greater ideology to bring the society towards? Is it more about correcting negative externalities created by a market system? The flourishing of just individuals being able to do whatever and be whatever? Is it more of a sort of consensus kind of thing, less the general will of the ideology mentioned earlier, but more each individual kind of community or demographic with their public voice being made part of policy? Well, the answer can be all of these, none of these, a variety of these, because truth is, wherever you might fit into the base, even if you're a labourer or what have you, you're more than just labour. You're more than just a worker. You're also a human is also a social being. And yes, there's more than one way of being social. I just thought this was a good picture to illustrate the idea of being social. So what does being social even mean? Well, we got another few presentations and we'll talk a bit about it then. See you in a bit. Hello. So let us talk about being social. And yes, you see this pretty wholesome, pretty traditional, pretty stereotypical image of being social. I can understand you might be thinking, yeah, that's a bit of a sort of generic image of two people being social. And that is fine. I just wanted to give you an idea, because yes, not everything is as wholesome as this, but it gives us a starting point on the idea of being social. And yes, I'm going to talk about cycles of history a little bit, but don't worry. Most of these cycles would not begin until the 18th century at the earliest, and for most people probably even later than that. Because truth is, most people weren't really politicized beyond their local area. The local goings-on of the built environment and the families that they're around, and sort of being themselves within the sort of local social groups, but because people largely knew each other, you didn't really have these sort of great impersonal characteristics that would affect most people for a lot of human history, because you barely interacted with anyone outside of your homeland, outside of your home village even. And so the extent of politicization was the fact that a small number of people owned the land, and most everyone else worked their tools. But we've already covered that, so let's carry on. And we have the idea that, yes, maybe state and capital, well, different historians argue on how much it was state, how much it was capital, that really started to politicize everybody, that thing that they called turning peasants into Frenchmen. But I needn't bore you with such theories of history now, for when we are world building, we can look at other things. So we have our economic dialectic, that between the public good or public interest and the private sphere or private interest. But we can look into this in more detail. So, what even is a public interest? Maybe it's an ideology, the sort of ideal of how a society ought to be organized, that we should organize our economy around and marshalling our economy in order to make these things happen, after all. And bear in mind, this is a non-identitarian view of politics. We'll get onto the identitarian side later, because a lot of the economic side is about trade-offs. So this ideology, it could be an ideology. Now, does that have to be left-wing or quote-unquote left-wing? Not necessarily. Maybe it's a religious fundamentalist ideology, an ultra-nationalist organization. You get the picture. You're just moving society's economy towards supporting an ideology. Maybe the public interest is a bit more presentist, or sorry, I'm not sure exactly how to express this term, but the idea of correcting negative externalities. Maybe that's your focus for your public interest. Or it's more of a democratic in that sense, you know, majoritarian, populist, will of the majority. Hey, or plurality. And that could be your public interest. What about your private interest? What kind of private interests exist? I mean, there's obviously the economic side, you know, money, buying stuff, selling stuff, working profession, that sort of thing. But there's also people's material goods, you know, their consumer habits, what they buy, what kind of material culture they're into, or more the geographic. After all, people live in an area, and so you can have this kind of private interest working in the dialectic. So now let's go to the cycle. Somebody's identity. Now, we talked a little bit earlier about this kind of thing. I'm not here to talk about things like movements like Black Lives Matter, Pride, I'd Land Back, and so on. I'm not considering as identity politics for this, because in a way they're not about exclusion, but more the fulfillment of the democratic promise to bring everyone in to the to recognition in the body politic. Whereas, to my mind, identity politics is a lot more about exclusion, more about the ideal definition and fitting society around it, fitting people into the mold, basically creating the politics of we have a mold and we want to fit everyone into it. We want to cast everyone in this ideal. And so, this sort of preset idea of what things should be, and we move it towards that, not take the world as you find it and get the body politic to recognize their personhood. So, that misconception out the way, let us ask about this idealized form. Because it can come from a few places. Perhaps it's a pre-modern, as some people call it, based on a sort of inherent nature, a folklore even, as you might call it. But we'll get onto the types of this sort of naturalistic identity here. Or it could be a value-led, an independent ethic, an ethical identity. Or perhaps more of a spatial identity, what some call the postmodern, individual finding their way in a society in space. So let us clarify this detail more. First, with that sort of naturalistic, it could be purely natural, based on a sort of understanding of how nature works, maybe pseudoscientific, what have you, that there's a sort of natural rhythm to the universe that everyone needs to fit in order to obtain their better happiness. Or maybe it's defined by a sort of set of cultural norms of a specific people group, which you can, learning the rituals of the group. Now, unlike ethnology, an ethnological identity, which we'll cover later, you could theoretically learn the ritual and be ingratiated into the group. But we'll get onto that later. Or perhaps this naturalistic is more a virtue kind of idea, or specialized virtue, to be more specific. You know, if one wants to be X, one must build around this kind of personhood, these kind of skills, these kind of qualities, these kind of virtues. So let us move on, speaking of, to the ethical identity, as it were, that are given people, sometimes found when a society starts getting heterogeneous and they can't draw on the sort of naturalistic or folkloric, you know, the kind of naturalistic identities, perhaps, and find various different cultural groups come together. So they come up with an idea that we all share a common ethic, be that, as say, a sort of deontological ethic, that there is a set of rules by which we flourish, or again a sort of virtue ethics, perhaps, being the best kind of, and focusing on that kind of personage. You know, and in this case, the ethics-based identity is more about fulfilling a specific societal role. The mother, the father, the soldier, the cook, the carer, the teacher, und so weiter, und so weiter. And then, of course, or perhaps this ethic is more of a consequentialist type. Maybe the classic utilitarianism of what is the best option, or situationist, like what is the most loving thing. You get the picture. Then perhaps we cycle towards a postmodernist understanding, where this is the person trying to see where they fit into this space. What is their role? And you start getting a lot of these sort of traditionalist, pseudo-traditionalists, because they were sort of ethical norms, this kind of things breaking down, and people start asking the question of, well, who am I? And so we ask the question of what is the right thing to do? You know, are we a nation of individuals who are all, and we're all sort of like building towards our own personal flourishing, our own personal truths? Is truth found in consensus? You know, what does the majority think? Or maybe it's a sort of not so much majoritarian idea of consensus, but more a sort of everybody has to be heard kind of consensus. What is the word? Never mind. You get the idea, a sort of equity. You know, everybody has a seat at the table. Everybody has to be spoken to, and everybody has to be listened to. A sort of relativism relative to the self and the self's cultural context. Anyway, these kind of things rotate around, but there is another idea, rather than either the economic dialectical trade-off or the cyclical ethical identity, as it were. And that is the sort of naturalistic kind, some call ethnic, although this can be a bit misleading, because sometimes the lines are drawn on gender rather, or biological sex, which we'll get into later. So what is this kind of naturalistic idea of community? Well, it's almost like the idea that human identities, nations and such, are fixed, rooted in our biology. Hence why they'll often treat gender, which is a social expression, and biological sex as one and the same. But this, even though what it even means in a social context will vary across different cultures, and often very much around figures of leadership, power, the will to power, as Nietzsche might have put it. That there's a sort of leading and following leadership over this, or perhaps as opposed to just being around leadership, that there's a sort that the nation that all nations are distinct and fixed from the beginning in a through line throughout history that has defined that people group, as opposed to a more fluctua, which other theories of social interaction would go with. Or the most simplistic of all fear. You know, we are the group. We know who we are. The others are out there. We are here to destroy the others. That is this sort of idea. But let's move on. Because what about the public good? Or, you know, because a lot of these ideas can sound a bit mutually exclusive. As though the societal cycle, as in the sort of ethical cycle, and the economic dialectic and the sort of naturalistics are mutually exclusive. But this is somewhat of an illusion, because you can still have community, as opposed to having everyone sort of hiving off from one another. People can sort of meet one another. If there's spaces for people to meet, to interact with one another, they're less likely to fall for demagogues. They're less likely to be fearful of their neighbours if they get to see their neighbours, if they get to interact with people, real people, not just looking through the lens that they've been provided, but getting to form their own life experiences. Also, physical needs. When people have their needs met and life aspirations are available to them, the sort of conflict style of human relationship is less appealing, because conflict is risky. But if you've got nothing to lose and possibly a lot to gain, you're more likely to go with things when, unless if your life is okay, the more secure people are, the more people are happy to see other people around them and be more relaxed about the way that their life is. But there is another thing as well, the autonomy of the people. People to be themselves, to be people, and just live freely within their sort of communal structure. Now you might think, but surely people are conflictual by nature. They're competitive, Well, that is one thinking, but and you might say, well, yeah, that's handed down through history. Well, not really. After all, as we said earlier, most of human interaction was largely localized. There wasn't much competition before. We know that this world where apparently everyone is set against everyone else is something of a more modern invention. Hey, I'm just trying to help you write worlds that you can imagine that things can be different, or can be basically understand why some of the structures exist. So it's more fun that way. Well, we're coming to the end now, so I'm going to give you a little talk later. See you in a bit.
So I guess this whole series, it might seem a bit fatalistic. All these identities and institutions and systems that govern your world. You might think, oh, so my character can't really do anything. But, well, that's kind of why I've got out some cards. And yeah, it might be true. You might think that. And that wouldn't be unfair, but... Well... there is a caveat. Because you see, free will and determinism are not entirely mutually exclusive. Think of it this, one way I like to think of it is about this way. Obviously I'm shuffling the cards here, but still. When you play a game of cards, you don't know, normally, what card you're going to draw next. Oh, then draw two. You know, you don't know what cards are going to get drawn. You don't know what your hand is going to be necessarily. What you can do is know how to play them. Know what you can do with the cards you've got. And working that out's a bit more complicated in life. So your character might well have a situation where they're trying to work stuff out, but that's where that final part of it comes in. The final piece of the puzzle. Morals. Now, for our purposes, morals are not the same as ethics. I'll probably go into more detail because that's more of a philosophy kind of subject rather than necessarily a politics one. But when you think about it, politics, in terms of politics with your morals are something that comes from within. Ethics are imposed from a higher standard, or at least a higher social standing, perhaps, you know. They're a system imposed from without, if you'd prefer a... there. Not something that comes from within. That's where morals come in. Morals, by your sense, you know, learning that sense of ought, as Hegel would put it. Or right and wrong, if you prefer. Developing that sense of how things should be. It takes time, takes practice. We mentioned it before at the beginning, but when your character develops this sense of morality, understanding how things should be, seeing their fellow persons as possessing ought, and respecting their ought and understanding the... Now, yeah, it'll take a lifetime to understand morality and understand right and wrong. There's a reason why there are people who dedicate their lives to this subject. But that can be for you a question of your character. So, when faced with all these systems and their place within them, what does your character do? What does your character do about them? You know, they're dealt their hand, so how do they play them? And that is all I got on the politics of writing. Well, hope this was a fun series, or at least somewhat enjoyable. Probably won't be doing very much politics in the future, but... well, for the time being, and then, if you liked the series or didn't, if it was useful or not, it was lovely having you here.